Welcome back to Howler Bike Park, the future home of one of the craziest looking mountain bike trails I'll ever get to be a part of building. The trail I'm working on is a dual slalom type line that crisscrosses over one another the entire way down with the use of massive wooden features that I'll be building. In the last video, we made our starting hub and began the trails with a huge berm on one side and a drop going over it on the other. In this video, we'll be continuing both trails further down by adding a literal mammoth-sized tabletop jump that one line will jump over and the other will ride under. I can tell you right now, this is by far the largest and most intimidating project I've ever taken on. So to start something like this, I have to kind of take in a lot of factors like the speed coming in, how high it needs to be for this trail that you guys are sitting on to pass underneath. I need to factor in how far I think this thing's gonna go, but mostly want to avoid overshooting this thing. So how do you account for all that? Well, in my mind, making sure the rider going underneath wouldn't hit their head was priority number one. Once I knew how tall that needed to be, I could then measure how tall my jump would have to be, the length of the top portion, and how much landing I would have to get back down to the ground. Just a tip, when designing something this large, it helps to have experienced riders around who have ridden things this big. I can get a lot done with math, but it's always nice to run rough ideas by people who have ridden things similar to what you're building. So, after deliberating with Taylor and Aiden on the measurements of this thing, what I ended up settling with was a 13-foot tall landing, a 17-foot top deck, and a 5.5-foot tall jump. Now, what those numbers mainly told me was I would need a lot of huge, long cedar logs. So, for an entire week, I spent my time searching, cutting, and peeling logs for this project.
That was perfect.
Now, I'm sure this just looks like I'm ripping down the forest all willy-nilly, but in actuality, the majority of these trees I'm taking down are ones that I saw were getting taken out for the base camp at the bottom of the trails. So, I made sure to use as many of those as possible so that they didn't go to waste. This whole week, literally 4 days now, I have been peeling cedar. That's it. Cutting cedar, peeling cedar. Cutting it, peeling it. I'm feeling insane. What's funny is I proceeded to cut and peel for another 2 days after this moment. But after that, I got a nice change of pace when Alex brought me some pressure-treated lumber up for the bases of the project. This meant we could finally start to see some visual progress. Luckily, days prior to this, I had done a rough SketchUp design to figure my spacing for everything, and even though it's ugly, it lets me figure out where the bases need to be sitting at. Once we had most of those down and rebarred into the ground, I could start working on getting my posts up the hill and stacked on top of the bases. Since it was the lowest thing to work on, I decided to start out with the ramp portion of the project. To start the ramp, I worked on getting my support posts up. It's important to cut a nice flat spot on the bottom of your posts to maximize the area that's supporting everything. Once they were up, I tacked some boards onto them to temporarily hold them in place and toe-nailed in the bottoms with massive lag screws. For these posts, I thought it would be fun to brace them together at the top using a mortise and tenon joint. So I went ahead and used a laser level to mark my tenons and then cut them out. Once they were cut, I scored them on the bottom of the brace log and then cut out the mortises. That is sturdy.
And after getting the brace slid on, I could then start working on getting the ramp made up. Now, I'm sure I do this way differently than most people, but I decided to put my boards on first and then cut my radius for the jump. In order to do that, I had to first design a ramp on my computer. Then, from the lip of the ramp, I drew a right angle out to the bottom of the ramp. With that in place, I could measure every 6 inches the distance from my right angle to the curve of the ramp. Now, the reason for doing all that is so that I could recreate that exact setup on my actual ramp. This ends up taking quite a while to set up in real life, but once everything is up where it needs to be, I can then just use a plumb bob and measure down to the exact measurements on my design. Once I had my radius cut, I braced up the back and repeated the exact same thing on the other side. When everything was finally cut out, I couldn't resist adding on some decking. It was so rad coming out the next morning and seeing this thing finally up. But I didn't let it get to my head too much because I still had about 2/3 of the project left to do, which meant anything could still happen. So Taylor and I got to work bringing the rest of the posts up by strapping them to the side of the UTV. These things were super heavy and up to 13 feet long, so we had to bring them up this way in order to get them through the woods. Once we had them up there, I went ahead and started standing them up on the bases. The main thing I was trying to do here was cut nice flat bottoms on the posts and keep them in a straight line on top so that when I laid my brace across, they would all sit directly under it. Most of this process is just eyeballing it, but having the laser level there was definitely nice for added assurance. And all these boards I'm adding are just pieces that I'm temporarily using to keep the posts in their spot. Once I had most of the posts up, I could start working on the bracing on top. For these, I decided to go with sort of a round notch joint. To do this joint, you simply place your brace on top and then score the shape onto your post using this compass looking tool. After that, you cut out your shape and then your log should fit nice and snug in that joint. That is, if you don't fall out of the sky before you cut the shape out.
Boy, oh boy. That hurt. I'm alright. Nothing bad happened, luckily. I got very, very lucky there. Yep, gonna be more careful now.
Don't follow me for any safety advice, people. Anyway, I managed to get the joints cut out and brace put on, which meant we could start putting the runners on that go from the jump to the landing. And if you thought what I just did was super dangerous, well, we're about to top it. These were 18-foot logs that probably each weigh about a half a ton, so we had to lift them using the bigger excavator we had on site. This was beyond sketchy, but honestly, they all went up pretty okay. And after this point, everything else was super easy to handle in comparison. So I was super stoked to push on and get this project done. From here, I did some small notch cuts on the underside of the log so they would sit flush on the braces. After that, I kept working on getting the other braces on the tops of the posts, and while I did that, the guys worked on getting all the cross braces up. Here I'm using the string as a guide for where the top of my middle brace should be. And after getting all the braces up, once again I could not resist getting more decking on this thing, so I cut thinner pieces and attached them to the rounded portion of the lip of the landing. For this top decking, I left a few boards longer on the end so that I could come back and add railing on once everything else was finished. And while I went through and braced up the bottoms of those longer boards, the guys were busy building up the dirt portion of the landing. We decided to go with half of this feature being dirt because it needed to berm hard left right after you landed. So, to keep the dirt off of the wood, Aiden Taylor first started building up a gorgeous rock wall. Once I had all the decking on and cut flush, the only thing left to do was to put some finishing touches on the dirt portion of the landing and to get the railing up. Luckily, the guys had already cut and peeled all the railing pieces, so all I had to do was cut them to size and stick them up, which is much easier said than done. With the railing up, I could finally breathe easy. This project was done and ready to ride. But first, let's pay the bills and say a huge thank you to Vessi Shoes for sponsoring this video. Ever since I got my pair of Vessis, they are pretty much all I wear unless I'm biking or working. These shoes look freaking awesome and they slip right on without having to tie or untie them. But that's not all. This is my favorite part about these shoes. Vessis are 100% waterproof. So if you do a lot of hiking or just walking around in rainy weather, these shoes will keep you totally dry so you can keep on with your walk without getting that nasty wet sock feeling. And I'm clearly overdoing the testing of these shoes here by jumping in a pond, but even with doing that, my feet were still totally dry. So that's pretty impressive to me. Anyway, if you'd like $25 off a pair of Vessies just like mine or any of their other awesome pairs of shoes, head on over to Vessi.com and use code BTB at checkout for $25 off. Or just click the link in the description and get yourself a pair.
This is a dream, getting the royal scar, holding a diamond blade, throwing it far. You see me fly, you know they'll never catch me for it. You see me fly, the way I put my finger on it. You see me fly, you got it, then try to tell me you got the wrong guy. You see me fly, you know they'll never catch me for it. You see me fly, the way I put my finger on it.
A huge thank you to Max and Alex for giving this feature some real proper sends. I can't tell you how awesome it feels to watch riders send the crap out of something I made. I, on the other hand, didn't get to give my feature a proper go. I'd like to say it's because I was tired from working my butt off all day trying to finish up the railing before everyone got there, but it was mostly just me not feeling sendy that day. And this thing is massive, so it's something I'm gonna have to work up to. But don't worry, next time I will definitely send this feature. We've got plenty more to do on this trail, like maybe next time we're gonna build a massive wall ride with a hole in the center of it so one trail can ride through it. Anyway, thanks for watching, a huge thank you to all of my patrons, and I'll see you guys at the next build.